Thank you. And there's an elevator coming as well. My name is Christopher Case. I'm the lecturer in Polish Studies here at Columbia University, as well as currently one of two co-directors of the East Central European Center, housed in the Harriman Institute at Columbia. And I'd like to welcome you all to our second Polish Studies event and first Polish Studies event featuring translation and creative writing. So welcome you all here today. I'm glad to see both Slavic Studies community, Harriman community, and creative writing community present with us. Our event is devoted to the work of Jerzy Ficowski, an accomplished Polish poet, who, however, until now has been more known in the West as a scholar of the work of Bruno Schulz through his monograph, The Regions of the Great Heresy, a wonderful and path-breaking book on the work of Polish-Jewish author Bruno Schulz. Unbeknownst to most of us in the English language world, he was also an accomplished poet in his own right, one of the sort of great, I suppose, undiscovered treasures of the wealth that is Polish poetry in the 20th century. Jerzy Ficowski was born in 1924 in Warsaw, and he was a soldier in the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, in the during World War II. He studied journalism, philosophy, sociology in his youth. And interestingly, he also was instrumental in bringing the poetry of the Polish Roma to the attention of a reading public through his interaction with them, his travels with them, his presence in their community. He was also active as an anthologist of Jewish history and culture, particularly of folk poetry written by Polish Jews, and he translated into Polish poetry from Romanian, Spanish, and Russian during his entire life. In any case, he was also the author of 15 volumes of poetry. And so what we are going to hear today is a selection of the first English language anthology of his poetry to be published. And our two translators who are with us today are Jennifer Rhodes to my left, who herself is an accomplished poetry writer in her own right with 3 books to her name: Window Left Open, The Needle, and Cusp. I don't have any years on those.
I can tell you later.
Okay. And she is also active as a translator, not only from Polish, but also from French. She has translated selections and a novel into English from French. She's also teaching at the University of Rochester and a director of the Red Loaf Writers Conferences. Let's welcome Jennifer Grotz. Let me also introduce Piotr Sommer, who also is a creative writer in his own right, a Polish poet, an accomplished and longstanding Polish poet. He is the author of at least 2 volumes available in English, one known as Things to Translate. I'm sorry, 3 volumes, one known as Things to Translate, Continued, and Overdoing It. He's the winner of multiple prizes and fellowships. He's taught poetry at many American universities. He lives near Warsaw, as an editor of the Polish international journal of translation known as Literatura na Świecie, or Literature in the World, and as well as of a magazine of foreign writing in Polish translation. So let's welcome Piotr Sommer with us as well. And if I could just in the end, before we turn it over to reading of some of the poetry, just mention 2 other guests. We have here with us Matthew Zapruder, who is the editor of World Poetry Books, which is the publisher of the volume that we're presenting today. So welcome, Matthew. And we also have Polish lecturer emerita Anna Freilich with us today, who I'd like to mention as well, who in her own right had the opportunity to meet Ficowski and get to know him and interact with him. So corresponded.
Yeah.
So we have
Met many times.
met many times. So that hopefully will be something that we can take the opportunity to find out more about during our question and answer session. So, all right, welcome everyone. Thank you. Let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Piotr, who are going to begin with a reading of some of the work that is featured in the new volume. Each will read for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to question and answer. I'll have a few questions to start off our discussion with, And then we'll turn it over to you folks for your impressions, thoughts, feedback, commentary, and so forth. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Chris. Thank you for those wonderful introductions and organizing of the event. And I also want to say a word of thanks again to Matvey and World Poetry Books and everyone at Columbia University. I know this is a collaborative effort to host Piotr and me, and it's very special for us because the book came out during the pandemic. This is the first time we've seen each other in years after this long collaboration. So it's been really special to have these events, and today is our final one, the culmination of this time together. And I want to thank Piotr, my co-translator. We worked on this a long time.
I'm showing you to thank Matthew as
Yes,
the organizer. and
absolutely.
Yes, because I don't want to waste time later.
Yes. I think on behalf of us both. So just like Chris said, I'm going to start by reading a handful of poems, and then I'm going to turn it over to Piotr, who will do the same, but also probably let us hear a couple in Polish is the idea. So that will be, so Ficowski's actual words will be in the air. I'm going to start with an early prose poem of Ficowski's called The Empty Places After. It's in three sections, three numbered sections, which I'll read. And it doesn't specify in the poem, but I imagine this to be the landscape of Warsaw at the end of the war, as Chris was saying. Oh, Peter, come on in. You're just in time, and there's your chair. Ficowski was born in Warsaw and also died in Warsaw, and also fought in the war in the Warsaw Uprising. So this is The Empty Places After. Maybe I'll get just a second. Fantastyczne, you made it. 1. Here had been a tall horizon, running like a cat across rooftops, leaping over chimneys. That street is no more. The horizon escaped into the fields across the Vistula. What was left after buildings is sky, darker than the sky around it, like the wall beneath a removed picture. The pigeons, out of habit, fly higher up, and at night, on the 4th floor of air, the moon switches on. 2. Night is an empty place after day. Darkness is two-dimensional. Only the distant barking of dogs from nearby villages reconstructs space. And again, the lost distances ring out. If you were to go forward blindly, you would get just as far as standing there motionless. Anyway, you will only pass through the darkness at dawn. But the dogs, signs of the watching verse, assure that not everything is yet lost. 3. Empty places after someone tend never to be empty. They spread out in every direction. The area designated for the living isn't enough for them. The one who is no longer won't fit inside the tight circle embracing him in life. Since disappearing, he inhabits all places simultaneously, fills the most incomprehensible volumes. His elusive matter, his tangible spirit, replaces all our paths. It becomes a mole in the black earth of our dreams, and only time dislodges him from the places he had overtaken. But even then, the place isn't empty for an instant. After the existing memory, the substance of those who are gone grows silent. Their final residence is usually plowed for new orchards and new cemeteries. Someone else's orchards and cemeteries, not subject to our customs. It's very hard to, I've been saying this every time we give a reading, but it doesn't stop being true. It's hard to capture the range of Ficowski as a poet, both in terms of his subjects and his styles and forms. But I'm going to try here, but with this sort of motley selection. This next poem is called August 5th, 1942. And it's a poem that's part of his collection, A Reading of Ashes, that I think Piotr may also read from or talk about, which is a series of poems that Ficowski did not intend to be a project, but with these poems that were preoccupied with the annihilation of the Jews and the Holocaust. And these poems trickled out over many volumes. And in the end, he realized they could make a special collection, Oczytanie Poporów, which is translated in English generally as A Reading of Ashes. This poem in particular, August 5th, 1942, Ficowski wrote in memory of Janusz Korczak, who is a figure that may be familiar to many of you, a well-known, doctor, pediatrician. He had a nickname, Stary Doktor, the old doctor, but he was also the director of an orphanage in the Warsaw, the Jewish ghetto, and was well known for many reasons, and including the way he died, which was by choosing to ride with the children in the orphanage to Treblinka, although he could have escaped had he chose. August 5th, 1942. What did the old doctor do riding to Treblinka in a cattle car on the 5th of August, over a few hours of blood flow, over the dirty river of time? I don't know. What did the voluntary Charon do, ferryman without an oar? Did he give the children the remains of his winded breath and leave for himself only shivers in the bones? I don't know. Did he lie to them, for instance, in small, numbing doses, picking from their sweaty heads the skittish lice of fear? I don't know. But then, but later, but there in Treblinka, all the terror, all their tears were against him. Oh, it was only so many minutes. That is a whole life. Is that a lot or a little? I wasn't there. I don't know. Suddenly, the old doctor saw the children becoming old like him, older and older. They had to catch up to the grayness of ash. So when he was hit by an Askar or SS-man, they saw how the doctor became a child like them, smaller and smaller until he was not born. Since then, together with the old doctor, there are plenty of them nowhere. I know. I think I'm going to read one more in this vein. I think this is the most chilling of all the Ficowski poems that we translated. It's called The Hour is Ripe. It's night. The hour is ripe. Let's go kill the dead. If something or other is left, we'll turn it into nothing or less. If a bone is left, we will deny it. If they ascended to heaven, we'll send tall birds to peck them dead on high. If their word, their gesture dwells among us, we'll install faulty memory conductors. If what's left of them is just a sign, we'll turn it into a trademark, like, for example, rat poison. If what's left of them is orphanhood, we'll sever their separation in a family unification campaign. Because the dead are contagious. Because the dead are too eloquent. Because the dead have nothing to excuse us for. It's night. The hour is ripe. Let's go kill the dead. We cannot leave them prey to eternity. All right, I'm going to switch veins a little bit and start reading a couple of my favorites that I think show other sides. Ficowski wrote about many different subjects, as I was saying earlier. This poem is apocryphal. It's called The Apocrypha of the Original Apple, and it's a feminist retelling of the story of Eve and the apple. And I should say this was a really hard poem for Piotr and I to translate for many reasons, one of which was Ficowski's play and riffing with the word apple in Polish, jabłko, that he invents words and makes neologisms pretty often in the poems. So you'll hear some apple-y words, and that's what that's about. Apocrypha of the original apple. Verily, it is the apple that wants to be eaten, the apple of sweet ignorance of good and evil, a dappled appley Appleton. It sways, squeezed into itself like a fist until hurt by its own seeds. Quickly it revolves around its own impatience, so that Eve might have all the blushing at once. And saith the apple, verily, I am the apple that wants to be eaten, to know your tongue, your teeth, the roof of your mouth. Taste me, let it be as Moses commanded. However, from beneath her eyelids, Eve devours the sight of the apple, and by winking, divides its nourishing blushes into bites. She doesn't touch the apple, filled to the tips of her lashes by its red cry. And the apple, insane, flies off the branch, and Eve falls under the apple's blow. Matthew. I think I'm going to read maybe two more. And I'm going to turn now to a poem called Pantareia. It's a title poem of Ficowski's last book, Pantareia, which is again example of a neologism. He's taking this from Heraclitus Pantarei, which we translate usually from the Greek into English, everything flows. In Ficowski's case, he's making this into a noun, a sort of concept that I think is also, he's also using to address, as you'll see, a moth in this poem. Pantareia. Long ago in the Guam archipelago, I met the Pantareia, four-winged, with large slanted eyes, one on each wing, not noted in Linnaeus. Today she is flying to me, already halfway here. She hobbles in the airs, my three-winged one, asymmetrical. The Yupi typhoon tore from her the fourth wing. I keep it in this drawer, the left hazel one now asleep. Careful, don't touch because it's losing sight. And there, Yupi Junior lurks for one more sidelong glance, or maybe even three, slant-eyed. And you are flying after your ruin or to your ruin. Who knows, Pantareia? You are halfway now. So many years and years and years, only in flight and flight and flight. Oh, how long it is, this halfway. And before I turn it over to Piotr, my final poem that I'm going to look at or read is called Initial, The Initial in English. It's also the title poem of a book of Ficowski's called Inicial, which in Polish can also sometimes mean or denote an illuminated letter, like the first letter in a manuscript, which I like to picture when I read this poem, although it's, as you'll see, it's actually describing a snake, the garden snake. The Initial. Where the green snake at the bottom of a dark cellar, under the mossy covering of rumbling and wood, rolled around itself and unrolled from itself, like the intricate peeling whittled by a sword from the sour planetoid of a royal apple. I didn't look under the lid, didn't see the snake, but I knew him loop after loop as he drank the wet spots, as he grazed the darkness, and I understood down to the bottom after years that, like him on meanderings, had slithered to nothing, that it was simply so tortuously the venomous initial in my alphabet of dreams, and that in autumn it would be invisibly gold, and that it must have had a Latin name. All right, I will stop there. So you stand in the middle, you,
I need to stand.
Yeah.
Forgive me, but this
oh, you.
equipment is going to get me anyway. So I think I'm going to read in Polish first, especially as this gathering has the biggest number of Polish speakers as we have encountered so far. So initial. It's Jennifer was saying that this is one of her most favorite poems by Ficowski. And I would only add that this is also one of my favorite poems by Ficowski. Yet, because we have translated so few poems by Jerzy Ficowski, I think we don't know how many of them can be very favorite still. Anyway, inicjał. Gdzie wąż zielony w ciemnym losku na dnie, pod pokrywą omszałą zdudnienia i drewna, zwijał się wokół siebie i rozwijał z siebie, jako bierka zawiła, zestrugana mieczem z kwaśnej planetoidy jabłka królewskiego. Nie zajrzałem pod wieką, nie widziałem węża, ale wiedziałem go pętla po pętli, jak pił wilgocie, jak się pasł ciemnością. I zrozumiałem aż do dna po latach, które jak on w meandrach spełzły mi na niczym, że to po prostu był aż tak pokrętnie jadowity inicjał w mych snów abecadle. I że jesienią bywał po omacku złoty, i że łacińskie musiał imię mieć. This comes from a book called Inizio, which is a fairly late book in his life. I can't remember the date, but it doesn't really matter now. You can tell me.
1970.
Yeah, 1970.
Oh, no, that's not true.
No?
1994.
84,
Nine-
94, that's right. So he was still around for another 10 years. But I think I'm going to get back to a few early ones. And maybe I'll read a couple of early ones, and then I'll read maybe two or three sort of dealing, if that's the way to put it, with the war and what happened and how he felt about it. And then I'll go to one or two others, and maybe reading one or two in Polish on the way. Apricot time. It's probably right here, out of the right moon rising, that a pit fell once, because it isn't just the moon's other side we don't know, but also its pit. And that's what started the apricot orchards outside Varna. Down sits the black bearded gardener, God the Father, with the planets in his basket, and bites into the full fruit. After each mouthful, we're in a different phase of apricot, in apricot time, quick as the passing of a scent, until the new moon, when Mirza, the gardener, spits in a godly manner the meteor of pit. And that's another one from his early days, that is sort of mid-50s, late 50s. Behind the door, the world. They come, they go, the handle nods, the door sings, wind rushes through. adults arrive from the world whose door has a silver handle. Aunts, uncles, grandmothers come in bringing their smells. The other people's voices, loaded with amazement, not their own, with pockets full of curiosity. Then they go behind the door, which with a silver handle, and get locked away with a key. And when there is a knock, that means that they will come back out of the closet, just behind the door, where the house ends, where guests and uncles loiter, say nothing, wait to be let in. Very still. And all of them, each on his own hanger. The part that I'm going to read now is called My Unsurvivor. And sometimes we were very happy with what came out of our efforts. And sometimes we could live with what came out of our efforts. I don't know about this one, but it has some good moments, I think, in our translations, and some moments that cannot be done better, I think. Maybe someone else could do them better, but I doubt it. It's the difference of the structure of languages that makes it very hard. So this poem, My Unsurvivor, is a fairly famous poem by Ficowski, and I think it's a really incredibly beautiful poem in Polish. It's dedicated to the memory of Bruno Schulz that Christopher was mentioning, was part of his life endeavors. And why don't you sit down? There's one here. I'm sorry about this handle.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for that.
That's right. Yeah, Bruno Schulz, you probably would know here. It was, yeah, so I don't have to even mention what happened. My Unsurvivor. For so many years now, in my entresol of wooden beams between the ceiling and the hall, 25 watts of everlasting light, obscured by fly drippings, glimmer behind a barricade of old papers. There he is, winding his watch. He doesn't brush away the spiders, he sleeps. By now he must have deciphered every wood knot. His still shadow overgrown by plaster. Sometimes he's not there, even after curfew. He spends time in Hyderabad, unlocks the next knot, goes back further and further into the wood. Today, my dream knocked on wood for him. Mr. Bruno, it's all right now. You can come down. But he waits for the unwaitforable. He cannot hear my dream. He, nobody, saner than anybody. He knows there is no entresol, no light, no me. Well, I guess I could, it's long, but I think I could read this one to you. In the famously so-called original.
What's Polish title?
Mój nieocalony. Mój nieocalony, pamięci Bruna Schulza. Tyle już lat na mojej antresoli zberek między sufitem a sienią. Ćmi światłość wiekuista na 25 lat. Zaciemniona pstrzynami much. Za barykadą makulatury. On tam jest, nakręca zegarek. Nie wygania pająków, śpi. Chyba już przetłumaczył wszystkie sęki. Jego cień nieruchomy tynkiem zarasta. Czasami nie ma go nawet po godzinie policyjnej. Bawi w Hajdarabadzie. Odmyka kolejne słoje. Wchodzi w drewno coraz drzewiej i drzewiej. W niemalowaną deskę sen mój zapukał dziś do niego. Panie Brunonie, już można. Niech pan schodzi. A on czeka na niedoczekanie. Nie może słyszeć mojego snu. On, nikt. Trzeźwiejszy niż ktokolwiek. Wie, że nie ma antresoli, ani światłości, ani nie. Well, this one is another one from the, oh, really, this one is not from the war. It was published in the 60s, and it's not even included because it wouldn't make really sense. Although it could make sense. In the Reading of Ashes, the one about Bruno Schulz. In fact, a friend of mine who was editing now a new edition of the Reading of Ashes was asking me what I thought about including this one in the sequence, or maybe adding a few others to the sequence in that book that would sort of complete the subject's matter, so to say. I said, no, don't do that, because you don't want to sort of utilize and instrumentalize anything that touches on the Jews. You don't want to do that. So, but maybe I was wrong. So I want to read the poem, which is called, in English, Tell How It Was. 66. I mean, the page is 66. I'm older than that. 66.
And the Polish language?
Opowiedz jak było. Tell how it was. So yes, I took part. It was the war. Then it wasn't. I came out of camp. I'm sorry. So yes, I took part. It was the war. Then it wasn't. I came out of the camp, deloused and free. So the stars above me were too many. Out of habit, I was delousing the sky. Once they multiply, good God won't give a nod. You'll have to throw the whole sky away. So they were saying about me, oh, he came out of the forest, but I did not come out. It was the forest that went away. Hey, boys, I'm standing, shot with axes, standing still in the clearing, in the monotonous rhythm of a march. When was that? I'd have to ask Stasek, but he's dead. I don't want to bother him. So maybe I'm left with some pine needles, a cap untouched by fire, eaten by moths, and all of our guys not standing in the clearing. It's the forest that stands above me. 20-something years old. I don't want to remember, just like they can't. So do not ask what else and how I came out of this in one piece. Let's say in almost one piece. That's it. There's nothing to talk about.
There's
Absolutely. I mean, if you don't do it, you will not know what's good. Well, the next one is going to be one of the Jewish sequence, one of the annihilation sequence, one of the Holocaust sequence, one about the war, and it's called The Jews Left. She got a wardrobe. Dresses still had time to go out of, though they'd go out of fashion anyway. An armchair from which someone once got up for a moment, and that was enough for the rest of his life. Platters, pots full of hunger, but they'll be useful for filling up. A portrait of a slain girl in living colors. She could still get the black table in good condition. but it didn't look right. Well, a little sad somehow. Well, I'm going to read now one which is called Tangolia, 1936. Yeah. And that one I think I'm going to read in Polish as well, because it will give you a sense how problematic some of our choices are, because it's a good idea to give a sense how problematic we have been and turned out. So it's not the thing that cannot be corrected, that improved, and so on, as any good translation, because I think it's pretty much a fairly good translation, but on the other hand, it always can be improved. So I'm going to read Tangolia 1936. Tangolia is one of the inventions of his, and it's not that he was inventing neologisms out of the blue. They're very well embedded and rooted within the language. So, like Panchareia is a nice one. But in our translation, you can only look at them as particular grains of wheat or something, particulars that you don't have the context within the Polish. And within the Polish, they are part of the larger sort of structure of thinking about the language, I think, in this case. Tangolia is you have the tango in it, and you have the lia, which is, I don't know, like in Polish it comes from Latin and Greek, but it gives you a sense of a place. So it's like he's really talking about a kind of pre-war Dacha when he was a kid. Tangolia, 1936. And well, I shouldn't really be talking about what we have managed to do and what we didn't, because you will quickly recognize that, of course, after I have read the Polish original. Our little Sicily of the woods, our summer Tangolia, with a view of the postcards from Uncle Cleophas, the soprano on the gramophone, my charming dream. If the weather permits, the storm will pass us by. Lola is smelling the fresh air. Oh, her pointed breasts, unbuttoned with her breath 3 buttons of her blouse. Abram brought a fat hen. She died from swallowing a straw. So now for dinner, an oily-eyed broth. Grandfather lengthens his moustache with noodles. On the coffee table, an old catalog of agricultural machines. And Saint Jacek is a dead ringer for the Jack of Clubs. If not for his glasses, grandfather would play whist with him. Aunt Grustinska hums an old song, just the beginning. The rest she forgot. Now, how did it go? Bah, the late Antosh would know. At night, the Mathiola smells. Milk curdles. Lola dreams. Tangolia 1936. Sycyliów nasz podlaski. Letniskowa Tangolia z widokiem na pocztówki od stryja Kleofasa. Wyskańczyć gramofonu czarowny mój śnieg. Jeśli pogoda dopisze, burza przejdzie bokiem. Lola wącha świeże powietrze. Ach, jej piersi czupatki. rozpinają oddechem 3 guziczki bluzki. Abram przyniósł tłustą kurę. Ona połknęła słomkę na śmierć. No to na obiad rosół wielkooki. Dziadek przedłuża sobie wąsy makaronem. Stary katalog machin rolniczych i święty Jacek kubek w kubek, jak walet treflowy. Gdyby nie okulary, zagrałby nim dziadek lista. Ciotka Gruszczyńska nuci starą piosenkę, sam początek. Dalej zapomniała. No jak tam było? Antuś nieboszczyk wiedział. Nocą pachnie maciejka. Zsiada się mleko. Lola ma sny. I don't know if I really have anything to say about that, except maybe as an example of the difficulties that we probably couldn't overcome and the difficulties that we did overcome. One is that Abram przyniósł tłustą kurę, about this fat hen that was brought by Abram, the Jewish guy in the nearby village, who was saying in Polish, ona połknęła słomkę na śmierć, which is a sentence that characteristically spoken with the sort of Yiddish intonation and also the structure of the phrase, ona połknęła słomkę na śmierć, is unheard, it's sort of wonderful. It's the way that he was also including a type of marginal languages that nobody was caring about. And this probably we had to transfer in a fairly neutral way. But the other one, i święty Jacek kubek w kubek jak walet treflowy. Well, I think we were quite good in having it as, and Saint Jacek is a dead ringer for the Jack of Clubs. So yeah, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but we're happy with it. And the final one that I think I'm going to read to you is we, just in English, the one that we finished the book with, and it's from his last collection, Pantareia. We, animals superior by our own nomination, we with our disappearing tale of instincts, because without them, it's easier to persist in our stubborn error. Our opposition to nature makes her itch. So she scratches herself and shudders with a tsunami, for instance. Then we die out a little, and those who remain feel very sorry. Now we have like 40 minutes or so for
Yes,
whatever.
Whatever, yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Piotr, for those wonderful readings and for that introduction to a incredibly sensual and dynamic poet in your presentation. I have some general questions about the genesis of the project and the sort of the challenges that you encountered in bringing it to English. But I think in light of the material that you have just read and its sort of materiality and sort of a demonstration of kind of the meat of the text itself, I want to open it up as soon as possible to folks to get a reaction to the text that we've heard. So maybe I'll just start with a general question and then open it to folks for sort of for thoughts. I guess two questions really, and you can answer either one that you wish or combine them. One of them you've already talked about. First of all, I'm really struck by the range of Ficowski. It seems quite remarkable that here's a poet who can be both specific yet also mythological. Think about cyclical time, but also specific historical time. The way that he combines mourning and humor at the same time, and there's sort of a materiality to his language, but also sort of a timelessness. But then also this kind of surreal playfulness as well. So there are so many different, this is for both of you, there are so many different, I suppose, what faces or dimensions to his poetry. What particularly drew you to his poetry? What spoke to you? How did you arrive at the project? And what in his poetry did you find in your own translation work that I suppose spoke the most to you? So that would be one question that I have, sort of the range of Ficowski and which aspect of his work speaks to you the most. The other one is technical. I was fascinated by what Piotr was saying about the Yiddish intonation of the Pochnęła Słomka na śmierć and so forth. And I was also particularly interested in the poem Muniel Talone, My Unsurvivor, about some of the language in that poem, the drzewie I drzewie, the sort of the older or woodier or something like that, and the czeka na nieczekanie, waiting for waiting, and so forth. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about maybe in My Unsurvivor, the challenge that you encountered in translating those specific neologisms. If you want to talk about that, or another aspect that technically challenged you, but maybe opened up an area of the poetry to you in a new way. And in general, I suppose, again, what draws you to the poetry or drew you to the poetry in the sort of initial moment of the sort of encounter with his work and the conception of the project.
Whatever.
Yeah, you could go. Right? Yeah.
Well, there was nothing specifically nothing outside the writing itself that I think brought us to the project. I just happened to know Jerzy Ficowski for a long time, and because of that, I slowly was discovering, or rather maybe the writing was sort of revealing itself to me in the course of many decades almost. Because when I was a kid and was reading his poems for the first time, a kid of 18 or 20, and it just didn't speak because it was dealing with the lore. What young guy in Poland would wanting to write, and writing would have been drawn at that age, at 18, 19. Very few, I mean to say, to the sort of folklore and the old language. No, it was difficult to recognize. I recognized it maybe some 15, 20 years later, and gradually was realizing how much he was neglected. Even Chris, when he was very nicely introducing us, he was using a few times the word also. He was also a poet. But he is also an accomplished poet. I think these words can pass in the context where the image of Polish poetry is still very much dictated by the old guard, so to say, by people who were rather interested in themselves most of the time, unlike Ficowski, who was interested in everything around, in what seems now to be the basic possibility of Polish culture, but at the time was completely neglected and marginalized. The Gypsies and Jews and Wojtkiewicz, a painter, a neglected painter, died at 29 or 30. Bruno Schulz even. All those things could only happen, I think, in case of Ficowski, because he was a poet. And being a poet gave him the authority to be doing it and to be saying things which could have sounded radical, and because he was quite a radical guy. He would be actually surprised to hear the word feminist applied to his writing. Not that he would be against it. No, he didn't belong to the other side. No, but the idea that you have to ideologize that a little bit in this country, he would sort of be feel a little bit old, I think. So then we met in Rochester, and maybe you want to go on. Yeah, how it happened to you?
How it happened to me.
Yeah, that was the question, right?
Yeah, I can add on to that. Well, so yeah, we met, so I teach at the University of Rochester. I moved there in 2009. And my first year there, I happened to be having dinner with the poet John Ashbery, who was still alive. And he knew that my great interest in Polish poetry and said, why have you not met my translator into Polish, Piotr Sommer? And it should go, I mean, Piotr, in addition to being a poet, is also a very accomplished translator of American and English poetry into Polish. And I knew his work very well, but it's true, I hadn't met him. So I took Ashbery up on this and I invited Piotr to Rochester. He gave a great reading. He visited my Polish and American poetry course. It was such a hit that the university invited him back to be a visiting professor the following year for a semester. And so once we were actually colleagues, he presented this idea that we might translate Ficowski together. I didn't know anything about Ficowski. All I knew about Ficowski was that he was in Stanisław Baranczak and Claire Kavanaugh's anthology, Spoiling the Cannibal's Fun, the title of which comes from a Ficowski poem, How to Spoil the Cannibal's Fun, in our book. And both Piotr and Ficowski are represented in that groundbreaking anthology. But that was literally all I knew. So, however, there couldn't be a better person to undertake a translation project of Ficowski with than Piotr. So we did, and that's how that began. I think we thought it would not take as long as it did, but it became this co-translating is a really intense and unique experience. And also it was a thrilling experience. I really believe and agree with George Steiner's assertion that translation is an act of total reading, ideally. And there was something really powerful about reading together. And it felt like we were reading the poems more than translating them. I was trying to learn Polish at the time, and still am trying to learn Polish. So that was also part of it. But there was something else I wanted to say about the tech. Oh, you were asking about the Moje Nieocalone and some of the other some of the both Ficowski's range and also the technical questions. I have to say there were many things. There were some poems we just had to abandon, especially the Makowski poems, the ones that were very interesting, that had to do with Polish folklore, that just really was not something we could get onto the page, and also the use of rhyme. But I think a lot of the neologisms, we were like unwaitforable. That's something you can recover in English. I think there's something about I guess it's the German side of the language that allows us to invent and figure out what that is. So we actually had a fair amount of fun with that. At least I did as a poet. And I guess the only other thing I want to say about the range, I don't have anything especially to add to what you were talking about, except to agree with it and to sort of just remind, it's thrilling, again, I say this as a poet, to remind ourselves that Polish poets too get to write lyric poems and playful poems, and they don't have to only write about the war. Yeah, so he definitely did that.
Wonderful. And even when he's writing about the war, it's still a pleasure to read.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me open it up to our audience here. There's a lot of folks here. I saw sort of nodding and sort of intuiting things from the poem. So let's hear it. Yes, Sasha Bolshevik, yeah.
Thank you so much for reading and this nice presentation. Can you say a few words about your selection? How did you choose which poems you're going to include? You just mentioned that probably along with translation, that choice changed or not. And if you can say a few words about it.
Do you want me? So Piotr knew the work very well, as you can guess, and he also knew English very well. So we as co-translators, we each had the part that we did separately, and we had the part we did together. His part was selecting the poems that he thought we had a chance at, knowing English as he does it so well, and knowing Ficowski so well. So he assigned me sort of batches, like in the groups of maybe 15 to 20 at a time. And I think they started with the most simple, the ones that felt most possible. And then they would, each batch they got harder and more challenging. And some they also got smaller as the batches. So that was our process. I would go and make cribs or very rough translations, which we would then read and discuss literally every word. And Piotr would read the Polish several times, so I could sort of have the music. And we would read the English several times, trying to figure out what it wanted to be in English. So it was a very a long, slow, intuitive process. And only at the end, I think, when we went back and sort of cut some out, but mostly we tried to read them and take care of them and keep them all in the mix until towards the end.
Yeah, I would only add that maybe there was no, it was not divided into what you were doing and what I was doing. I think all of it was done together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The making of the translations, yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much. I think really this is one of the most exciting books of poetry and translation I've read in a very long time. And hearing you read it in your respective voices is such a pleasure, to hearing the collaboration at play in that language. Piotr, you mentioned in the afterword about the specific challenges of translating Ficowski's Polish because of the wordplay within Polish. I wondered, just hearing about his biography a bit more, if you see not just the wordplay, maybe this is related to it, but how he thinks as a translator, as in his poetry.
What?
How do you think his translator brain feeds into his poetry, if at all?
Well, you have a better answer to that, of how Ficowski, as a translator himself, how that may have influenced his own writing. You know those translations. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't know the answer really, but I think his concept of writing and his system, I would say his linguistic, his sort of, he has a very specific poetic diction, whatever that is, very specific, very inventive and very characteristic. You can recognize his two sentences easily if you, I think so, if you know the work well enough and read them carefully and know the context a little bit. He was always interested in translating. He did so many terrific translations. It's one of those things that naturally, but I mean, it's not that I have a better insight into it than Jennifer or anybody else here. But it seems to me that it's a natural thing that when you translate and happen to do it not as a sort of commission for money or something, but you do it because you want to do it, or you're interested, and then you discover how good the damn thing is. You learn from it. What you learn from it, you don't know. Maybe you can point to it a little bit later after you've published your things and see, wow, that's indeed something I learned specifically. I'm sure you can point to such things when you're a writer on your own and have translated some stuff. So, but to point specifically whether he learned anything concrete from Lorca, whom he translated, whether he learned anything specific from the folk Romanian anonymous writing that he translated, just wonderful. You would never expect the kind of book with folk stuff, quite a bad book, to be so movingly contemporary, if that's the phrase to put it. I mean, this is the masterpiece, one of the masterpieces of translation in the Polish language. So if you see such a masterpiece in Polish, like this folk stuff, how can you even come close to decide about what ingredient he could have learned? I don't know. It's very difficult to say.
Excuse me, you said Romanian. You
What?
meant Roma? You said Romanian language.
Yeah.
I think you did both.
No, I didn't mean Roma. I meant
You did mean-
Romanian.
Ah, because
Yeah.
he did Roma too, yeah.
Also,
And early
the Roma, the Polish Roma language that he learned when traveling with Polish Roma just after the war, and finding out this woman, Papusha,
Yeah.
whom he translated wonderfully. I mean, she's part of the Polish language now,
And she created her actually as a star.
I'm sorry.
He created her as a star.
He created.
Yeah. She. I don't know whether he created her as a star, but she now has been picked quite a bit by different sorts of media, and there was a movie about her. There was a book written about her.
But she came here. She was here. She
Yeah,
visited.
but I meant to say that his translations are masterly of that. I mean, you don't know how masterly they are in terms of representing and reflecting what's there in the original that she was scribbling, because that was really like, if you look at the manuscripts, it's just like a little bit of scribbling, and you don't understand a thing about it. But judging on the basis of how they work in Polish, it's wonderful. It's just wonderful.
But I don't know if you remember, but he was attacked in the here. in
Well,
the
he was
United
attacked by
States.
other gypsies who she
Yeah.
was attacked,
No,
and he was attacked
He was attacked
because
yes,
she was
in,
supposed to have sort of drawn from her the stuff that she was not supposed to tell. And so she was attacked and mistreated, and he was attacked,
He was.
even though he was the biggest friend. Yeah.
Other questions? Let me ask a little bit more about the, I'm really stuck on the,
I think there is a question.
oh, okay, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
You are both poets and you're translating together and you each have your own voice. And I know your poetic practice is in English, and yours is in Polish, but I'm wondering, did you always agree on what the voice of these poems was gonna do?
We fought a lot. We fought a lot, but I think there are a lot of reasons for it, and I learned so much from the process. We fought partly because Piotr would call me out when he saw instances when I was projecting what I thought a Polish poem, what I thought the poem should be or be doing, and also my own aesthetics. I was aware of Ficowski would mess with me, like he used capitalization and contrary ways that I didn't know how to teach myself in a workshop. So sometimes I wanted to tame him or neaten him. And I said this when we were talking elsewhere. When you translate solo, when I've translated singly, I notice a dynamic in my own process where I err towards trying to simplify and clarify just to understand or get, and then I try to not roughen it up, but make sure I'm honoring the complexity of it in the original. And that dynamic played out as a couple. So I would, and also my Polish is much weaker. So I was always trying to clarify, and he was always urging me, reminding me to roughen it up. So, but also we had affections for the poem. I mean, I would grow very attached to certain poems, and Piotr was very attached to certain poems, and word choices. And so we fought, I think, emotionally and intellectually, but it was also, I think, one of the most exciting reading and intellectual exercises in my whole life. And I felt like I really grew as a translator from it. And you had decades more experience of it than I did, and collaborating. It was my first time.
And in my case, I would say, yeah, I agree with the fundamental things that Jennifer was recapitulating now. But I would say that from my perspective, it's when you translate on your own. I think the spirit of translation for me is not about me, but about him or her.
Right.
The person that I'm translating. And so that's perhaps the reason why I always feel a little bit distant to the idea of all sorts of imitations that are so popular in American writing and have been for a long time, rather than translations. The famous example, of course, is Robert Lowe. In case of collaboration, and I have much less experience in that, although I had done some co-translations before. To me, it seems that the spirit of collaboration is reflected in the pronoun we. When we talk about, I mean, this is our thing. It's not mine. It's not the co-translators. It's ours. So with a little bit of experience of that too, that was my thing. I don't have really preferences so much. It's the original that has preferences.
Yeah, question back here. Yeah, please go ahead.
So I asked you this question last week, but I wanted to ask you this again about your co-translation tactics or maybe not tactics, but procedures, because I had always thought, of course, that Piotr would do the crib, and then you would bring the English language to the crib, and then Piotr would say yes but no, and then this is how I assumed that a co-translation might work. Now I know from last week that you said no, it was not that way, and you said this time too that you did the crib. And actually, I've been thinking about it all week, and I was just wondering. So, could you give an example of how it would work? I know that you had said that Piotr would send you the batch of poems, right? And then you would do the crib. And then what happened after that? Because I think we got a bit derailed last week when we were talking about all these things.
I would probably have to explain the concept of the crib. We need to know a little bit more about what the crib is. If you can do the crib, that's great. If you cannot do the crib, then you beginning from that crib from scratch, right? So initially, when Jennifer was not up to really, I think to produce any sensible crib, I remember having done quite a batch, and then we discussed that, and then we quarreled about that, and then we somehow it, in a way, I would say it didn't matter who was doing the crib, although perhaps my cribs were a little bit more useful because it was so difficult for Jennifer to understand. Am I making sense?
Well, you never wrote a crib.
Oh, I did. You don't remember that.
I don't. We also have completely different memories.
That's right.
I also maintained,
But-
we worked for 10 years, he maintained 7.
But the point I want to make is that it didn't really matter. It doesn't really matter which undercrib we were working on, because we were going through every single phrase and every single word. So even to say that, well, one of us came up with a good idea, or the other one of us came up with a good idea in English, that doesn't make much sense because I think the road that led to that good idea, the conversation, the discussion, the quarrels, is part of the process. So eventually, one of us may have said this. The other one of us would have said, like, Jennifer, you cannot say that in English. And so I was thinking about something else, or she was thinking about something else. And most of the time, naturally, Jennifer had the last word on the subject. Am I? No? Or am I being a little bit?
I've
Too
been
quick.
listening with, this is great. It's so interesting that we did the same, we wrote this book together and we have such different. No, I don't disagree with you, and I think that's actually insightful to hear, but yeah, I mean, I think
You
it,
don't disagree with me, but you have a reservation?
well,
I mean, am I saying something?
you know what was the hardest part about co-translating was that we both had to agree. And I remember just letting go sometimes, because otherwise we would have to lose the poem. So when you say I had the last word, I don't know. I think I did. I mean, I think you acknowledged that I was
On
listening
the
to it.
whole, I think you did.
I think
I wouldn't
that's-
have forced anything that much that you didn't, that you really felt bad about, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think that's also why I was emphasizing that the active translation of this making of crib that you're just that it didn't feel like translating in the early stages. It felt like reading a poem together. And maybe both of us
That's
making notes about it. And that happened several times in a row. I mean, I think I was the secretary. I kept the files on my computer. I had the Polish on one side, the English on the other. I would share it and we would look at that. But
it was nothing, if I understand Peter's question well, there was nothing of a separation. We were always coming back to it and started to discuss from that point where we were uncertain and wanted to move on, but we needed to complete that bit.
Yeah, well, we would do this on Skype most of the time, or if not in person. And if we were going to go back to a poem, we each had issues. Like I would want to pick like this, let's go back and look at this. Piotr would want to look at that. So we would attend both of our concerns. And it was really gratifying. It was really thrilling to revise the poems over the years. They got much better. I mean, it really did take us years.
Even though
Yeah.
I'd add,
Yeah.
when I was looking at some of them this morning, and maybe a couple of days earlier too, before our unnameable books meeting event, I was thinking, well, apparently it's enough what we have to make him sound in English well enough. Whereas I feel so much of it is ingrained in the language, in the rest of it, in the context. That on the whole, I would say, and maybe I shouldn't say that we have been successful in maybe dragging some 45, 47% of what's there. Whereas the rest of it has to go. We cannot have that.
Yeah.
In English.
We had to cut out. That's the final thing I think to emphasize about co-translating for me, that because we disagreed a lot and we had these different backgrounds and we both were convinced that we had to agree. When we agreed, it was it tended to be pretty strong.
Yeah.
And that was also really a wonderful feeling. Again, as a solo translator, I often feel very insecure about some of my choices, even if I'm consulting other people. It's hard to be the expert and it's just great when
But
two people agree.
It's a
good-
collective effort. I mean, translation is a sort of co-effort.
But we're sharing
Yeah.
that burden and that certainty. And our different knowledges. We're
Yeah.
pooling our knowledges.
Wow.
Esther.
Thank you both so much. This has been really beautiful. And I just want to add on to Peter's question, because in the last several years, and the idea of collaborative translation of the kind we've done, which sounds extraordinary to me, and this process you described, this kind of, wrestling with an angel, that you've both done for many years, I'm sure has enriched both of you and enriched the ultimate product. But there has been a lot of pushback against the idea of co-translation, particularly where one of the people is very strong in the original language and the other's not. I'm thinking of Tracy K. Smith and her translation,
Right.
which was severely criticized
Mm.
in many quarters.
I would like to see some of the.
Whose translations, for example, were so badly treated?
She was just saying Tracy K. Smith, who was a former poet laureate of the United States, a wonderful Black woman poet who translated, I forget the name of the poet.
Evie,
Evie.
I think it's called.
Yeah. And she co-translated with someone who actually spoke the original, and she just worked with English.
And that got
Right.
criticized.
Very strongly.
From what language?
Chinese.
Back to pound and
Yeah.
and translating from crib, and this whole idea that was very prevalent in especially the United States for a long time. So I just wondered, it doesn't sound like you two have faced any of that.
Well, that also, our process, I was much more invested in Polish poetry than Tracy was. I mean, I'd been studying it and going to Poland for literally decades. I mean, at that point, just a decade, if that. And I was trying to learn, I'd been studying Polish, and that was part of this project and this original process that Piotr would give me the assignments, and I would go practice, I would translate. The idea was incentivizing this a sort of fun way to be learning Polish, because of course, the reason I learned Polish or started to learn it was because I loved Polish poetry. And so I also was pretty deeply read in the tradition as well. And a lot of Polish poetry has been really well translated into English already. So I would defend that I had some contact, and I think Piotr would agree with that. I mean, you almost.
Yeah.
Well, correct.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just being a little bit silly. Why not be? Yeah. You read Adam Zagajewski, and you read Czesław Miłosz, and you read Zbigniew Werber, and you read Różewicz and Szymborska. That is the four and a half poets who were around in English, right? You didn't really. That's what I'm saying.
You know my bookshelves.
No, but I'm
But
saying.
yeah.
But there were not very many other Polish Polish poets translated into English in a way that you could really get a sense of them. Am I making sense?
Well, you have you have your, yes, you are making sense.
I'm what?
Well, I think you're politicizing it a tiny bit, but
No, you were, no, yeah, but I was looking at it.
but I had not read Ficowski except in the Baranchek. So yeah, that's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but certainly you were much better prepared to co-translate Ficowski with anybody I'd ever met. And because it seemed to me such a demanding job, I was very happy that you wanted, that you believed me that he's good enough, that you had some trust in me.
Yeah. But I would like to circle back with you maybe after. I would like to talk more about the Tracy K. Smith project and that critique, because I do think in many ways our ideas about translation are these sort of are changing, including even translating, the truism of translating only into your native language now, and in the past, the discouraging of projects that went in the opposite direction. I think a lot of this we're revisiting and problematizing in interesting ways. So yeah, I would love to talk more about that.
But your question about whether we did or didn't feel any kind of
Or
pushback.
critique.
Yes.
I think we-
Well, there wouldn't be any basis for that. In this case, I don't think so. So the one that you mentioned, the poet who collaborated, not knowing completely, and sort of in today, it sounds a little bit like the idea of it does instantly sound that way as the idea of Robert Lowell who was imitating. So yeah, and this is maybe not the time not the period when you can do it and get away with that. So, but in this context, it wouldn't apply.
Also thinking of the Czesław Miłosz, Robert Haas collaboration, and which is seen as a very successful sort of poetic enterprise. And I don't know to what extent Robert Haas made any effort to learn Polish or to, exactly, to sort of get into the, nuts and bolts of the actual grammar, the structure of the language. I mean, he simply worked with Miłosz as kind of a sounding board, a kind of, I guess, co-creator in English rather than a translator in the sort of literal sense of the word. So
I think that's right. Yeah.
There was a question over here.
Well, it's just more about wanting this conversation to go on that Esther started, and that because I think what's happening is there's a kind of educating that you're doing right here for us about what translation can do and how it's not about a source and a target language. In so many ways, and there's so many combinations, so that, it more, I think that was a problem about just not having an understanding of translation, right? And I'm not so sure it does have to do with the idea of imitation, or because I think, I think I hear your point about it's a different time. That's important, right now. But I also just think that we're having conversations. You guys are talking about battling it out and having different positions and almost kind of putting these questions of
Somewhat different.
no, exactly. But that's the beauty of it, right? I mean, it's just like a little bit, and therefore, I just think that if this kind of conversation was being had in the places where people were criticizing that translation, there would be just a lot more room to understand a spectrum. It's not like chum chum. It's mostly way in here, and that's where it's really helpful. So I think it's more about the translation culture rather than the translation.
I think we took the position of we in this collaboration, and we took the position of him, having him in mind. Yes, as our sort of basis to go.
Yeah.
If I could maybe ask, okay, I think we're running out of time here, but go ahead, go right ahead. If you have
Matthew here, could we quickly hear how this project came to you and your?
Actually, it was published a year ago. It won the PEN Award for, if you didn't know, this year, but I had nothing to do with this book except all of the events and publicity around it in this year, because I just joined World Poetry Books in January. But Peter Constantine, who's sitting there, had much to do with this, taking on this book project, as well as the managing editor at that time, Brian Sneeden, who Piotr and Jennifer worked with. But thank you for acknowledging it. The book is here, and it is for sale if anyone wants one at a discount. Student discount is even steeper than faculty discount.
You can't afford not to get one.
And maybe, Peter could talk about how the book came to World Poetry Books. I'd be happy to tell you about our future publications in Polish and in other languages.
It was like a very bright moment when it arrived, and very simple and straightforward from my perspective, because what happened was that Brian Sneeden had received it, I'm not quite sure how, but he came with it, and it was immediately so clear that this book had to be. So from my perspective, when we had our editorial, it was accepted within a few minutes. I don't know how quick it was in response.
I remember, I read a small handful of poems at the AWP conference for Arkansas International, because that poem, Inicial, was published in that magazine. And Brian came up afterwards and said, will you submit it to World Poetry? And so then I asked Piotr, can we send it to them?
Because before we really,
We've just been sending it out to
Just-
places.
yes, and we didn't get any response, or almost no response, or if there was a response, it was negative because it was so difficult to publish. So when Jennifer wrote me about Brian, and you wanted to publish it, because the publishers liked it. It was such a change of, you know, of the movement, don't you think? And we were happy, and we instantly said, yeah, that's
And I mean, a press that does poetry in translation,
right.
God bless you. Sign me up.
It's a pity that Brian Stevens not here. He's in England,
Yeah.
in Manchester, running the program there. But yes, he. I mean, my first encounter with the book was when we read it and then accepted it within minutes from my perspective.
Yes, I wanted to save time and didn't think initially, but I should take this occasion to say a couple of things, if you allow me. One is that
We have
this
to
is,
be done in one.
yes, we
minute.
have to read. I think Jerzy Ficowski would be delighted to know that the book is out, and that despite the sort of somewhat hostile attitudes towards him back in those days, he's going to make it, and that he's back in the Polish canon. I'm sorry to be using the word, and in Poland, and that he sounds more interesting than so many of his of those that were seemed to be more popular, and I want to thank Jennifer for this incredible effort of having to do it with me, and I want to thank Peter and Matthew for organizing all this, and this is our penultimate event, and
No, our ultimate,
I'm sorry,
our ultimate.
ultimate, I meant to say, yes, I misused, and yeah, so it's, thank you, I'm delighted and grateful.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And again, books are for sale over here on the table. And Matthew can at that point tell you some more about some Polish titles that might be coming out if you're interested. Thank you, everyone.
Gdzie można pani powiedzieć po polsku?